Now, colleagues, let's not waste any more time. And the time has come for after lunch session, which is entitled "The Role of Humanitarian Ties in the System of Comprehensive Partnership Between Russia and China." And I'd like to say that this is a big honor to be here with you in such a brilliant company. And of course, humanitarian ties, a very important, very substantial circumstance which directly drives the overall development. Incidentally, President of Russia, when speaking May 15th in Beijing at a well-known and many times mentioned today summit, was saying that, of course, one should start moving back towards general development. Even Asian-Eurasian space basically should imply relations not dissimilar to relations of former Soviet Union. And of course, many times was mentioned the importance of humanitarian, even interpersonal ties, because all this contributes to overall interaction. Of course, one can speak about this on and on, but I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker. But before I do so, I would like to note that our time is being limited, whilst the number of participants in the discussion is quite a few. So for our discussion to be better organized, I'd like to you to focus on the key points as far as interaction in the humanitarian sphere. In what way humanitarian ties might lead to comprehensive partnership? What details of comprehensive partnership would be implied in the discussion? There's lots of questions that are formulated here. How to formulate mutual interest between Russia and China, whether Russia and China will to conduct educational cooperation and the media cooperation. Clearly, we can only discuss this in very rough and broad strokes, but which is why I'd like to suggest give the floor to Mr. Dmitry Meznitsov, chairman of the Society of Russian-Chinese Friendship, the society which, together with the Russian Council for Foreign Affairs, many thanks to them for being organizers, co-founders of this discussion. When he spoke, actually, Mr. Dmitry Meznitsov, when he spoke at Beijing, he also spoke about many multiple directions of such humanitarian interactions. So in the space of decades, because the Society of Russian and Chinese Friendship has lived through the whole period of modern Russian-China relationships, starting out with friendship, then a period of animosity, friendship again, and now coming to the point where we are. So, Dmitry Fedorovich, you as a chairman of the association which marks its anniversary, as a pioneer of these activities and such thinking as far as Russian-Chinese friendship, you have the floor. And colleagues, I would really urge you not to overstep the limits of 7 minutes. Otherwise, we won't have enough time for all the speakers, particularly the speakers at the end of the line, who might even lose the chance of speaking to the audience. Now, over to you. Thank you. I was just thinking that when Mr. Igor Ivanov, who encouraged Society of Russian-Chinese Friendship to participate in this conference, and when we, as far as the agenda, we were thinking whom to suggest to be speakers at this session. So we completely agreed on Mr. Andrei Bystritsky, chairman of the Valdesky Club Foundation, person with unique journalistic experience, and I understand also the experience, a very good controller, because he did mention that 7 minutes allotment of time would be the maximum. This is not 7 years, just 7 minutes. So it was quite a lively introduction. So lovely introduction will make our session, which is devoted to living matters of humanitarian cooperation, involving essentially millions of people. So that will help it make our session to achieve better results and to be warm in tone, in character. As was mentioned many times today, the event which took place in mid-May this year in the capital of China, summit-level forum, One Belt, One Way. And the fact that the main guest at this forum was President of Russia, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, that holds a special significance which goes to confirm the scale and depth of bilateral relations, but of course also confirming the realistic character of the plans and proposals that were outlined by Russian President last year in the format of St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the Greater Asian Partnership. So now I'd like us to go back in mind, in thought, to Moscow, May 9th, 2015. It was that time, on the day during the visit of Presidents Xi Jinping, on the instructions of the heads of the state of Eurasian countries, Vladimir Putin signed with the Chinese leader a document which formalized the first steps, which were quite serious and weighty steps of interaction between Eurasian Economic Union, Eurasian Economic Union, and the programs of economic belt, Silk Way, which has been converted into One Belt, One Way program. At the same time, when we speak of these economic programs, we're probably aware that the interaction across the economic field is not possible without mutual understanding, not possible without trust. So, in the political section, Professor Lee spoke today that he felt first cooperation was important, and then with the trust following. One could perhaps give argument to that, which priority to give to this category as a foundation for relations. But without trust, there can be no interaction either in the economic sphere or in the sphere of providing regional security and stability. Also, let me remind you why I recalled May 9th of 2015. Let me remind you that chairman of the Chinese People's Republic was a guest of the Russian president at the parade devoted to the 70th anniversary of the victory in World War II, 70th anniversary of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War. So we saw the large-scale celebration in September. That's the same year taking place in Beijing, which marked the anniversary of the victory over Japanese militarism. Very vivid events, already part of the history. But when we speak of humanitarian ties, we cannot but speak of the need for mutual protection of historical memory. We cannot but speak, and the greater the external pressure, the louder we are obligated to say so, that the young generation should be not simply be knowledgeable about historical facts. A young generation should have a clear understanding which kind of plague, which kind of bane the Soviet people, members of the anti-Hitler coalition, Japanese warriors, saved their peoples and they saved the entire world. It's not an accident that there's work underway to erode historical memory. It's not an accident that it's passed in silence the role of the Chinese people in the struggle against Japanese militarism and the role of Soviet people in the struggle against fascism. So I want to speak about the plans not only in relation to the 60th anniversary of the society, of Friendship Society, and interaction as far as the society, interaction with other regions of Chinese regions and Russian regions. We cannot but be aware that those young people, of whom there are quite a few in our audience today, young people, 30 years from now, 25 years from now, maybe a bit later, will be assuming responsibility for the successes of their countries. That's clear and obvious sense that 30 years from now, I'm just taking 30 years as a span of generation, more as a symbol, less than an arithmetic sum of years. So those will be the people who will be determining what about the structure of interaction between Russia and China, what will be increased and multiplied, or God forbid, what they might choose to give up and move away or forget by accident, as it were. So we would like very much to see that the entire activity of Russian-Chinese Society of Friendship, which today has 19 regional chapters, and we would like that by end of the year their number should increase twice, and also across regions and the Russian capitals. One of its important priorities should be for society to support and principal expansion of youth exchanges. Of course, this is not possible to make it happen without interaction in the sphere of education. In a minute, we'll be joined by the head of the Board of Directors of the High Schools of Russia, rector of the Moscow State University, academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Viktor Sadovnichiy. without announcing any particular statements he might make in his speech, I'd like to mention one thing. In the year 2016, this foundation stone was laid in creating the first Russian-Chinese university in Beijing. So that's very logical, very sensible for a partner to be first Russian university in terms of its ranking, in terms of its history, in terms of influence, in terms of the quality of education it offers. And it's important too, and we'll be asking the heads of the joint university and also partners from Beijing Polytechnic Institute in the format of educational program, there should be a form of narrative describing our joint history, which not only counts different stages, as was mentioned, but also we have every reason to say today that essentially all the stages were positive, starting from 1949. Even though the foundation was shaped hundreds of years ago, some experts, diplomats, sometimes they have mixed feeling about the date of the 400th anniversary in terms of informal but maybe diplomatic ties, but those contacts really go back hundreds of years into the past. So it's important to remember and respect those circumstances. Since we gave the bell to Andrei Bersitsky, he said he's going to strike that bell every 7 minutes. I don't want to have to conclude after the sound of this bell. I want to conclude with several comments. We speak about the favorable conditions in interaction of people's diplomacy today. The reason mainly because the national leaders set the huge scale and potential of interaction between Russia and China across hundreds, not just dozens, but hundreds of different areas and directions of cooperation. We're seeing the successful work of numerous intergovernmental commissions. We see the results of the interaction of a number of departments and ministers of our two countries on the Russian side of some agencies. Today, of course, we'll be listening closely. Head of the Russian Agency for Assistance in the sphere of tourism. We are aware that without principal expansion of the flow of tourists, stories from books or stories even from films or from exhibitions will not be sufficient. And today, Professor Van, at the ceremony of unveiling, head of the Academy of the Social Sciences from Shanghai, yesterday when we had a meeting, he was speaking about, among other things, about pragmatical aspect of relationships. Yes, this pragmatic aspect should be an element in interaction in the humanitarian sphere. So I would like us in anticipation of this discussion, we need to be clearly realistic about this. We speak of friendship. That's definitely a fact of our relationship. We speak of trust, which drives relations of our leaders as the foundation of relationships. Yes, that's clearly a fact. But we also speak, when we speak about directions of cooperation, we need to aim at very specific and clear to understand the results. So in this sense, there are several obvious such areas, youthful exchanges, educational programs. It's not possible to implement those without publishing programs, without joint publishing programs. Let me announce now what I've been allowed to announce by Minister of Science and Education of Russia, Mrs. Vasilieva, a specific program which we approved with our Chinese partners. It's the program of publishing books of pictures jointly in Russian and Chinese languages, which are devoted to clear understanding of successful stages of our shared history. We feel that in the form of the first publication of such books of pictures, there can be 6 such stages. So we see this audience maybe starting from a 3rd, 4th grade of school to the 7th, 8th grade of school. We would like the program of publishing books to be correlated with the national competitions on how we know history. Russian school children know the history of China, and Chinese school students know the history of Russia. And for those competitions and contests to be held out publicly with the support of television and media, so the winners of these competitions will have the real opportunity annually, not just 1 or 2, 3 or 10 or 20, but maybe as a delegation, numbering hundreds of people, to visit each other. And there's no contradiction here. Now, every high school student has an iPhone and computer, and the book of pictures provides a perception of the of the soul of the masters who put efforts into this book. This is one of the nearest future publishing programs that we want to implement jointly with the Publishers House of the Chinese People's Republic. We have special feelings today about the initiative, which was indicated during the Valentin Matvienko's visit to China last year. We want to present a single book in Russian, Chinese languages devoted to the potential of interregional interaction. I can see well what you're suggesting, that the bell is about to strike. Yes. We want to announce this book during the days of the 60th anniversary of Society on October the 29th in Moscow and Beijing. We've received all the necessary approvals. We're getting on with this intensively. Let me mention that 51 subjects of the Federation of Russia in Russia has interactions with all the provinces of China's People's Republic, of all regions, and the 4 centrally governed cities in China out of 5 has sister cities relationships, not to mention regional centers. We have, and as far as such pairs, we have 123 such pairs, which is a very powerful potential of interaction. And today we're greeting here head of the Russian Museum, National Russian Museum, academician of Russian Academy of Arts, Mr. Gusev. We're seeing that the potential of the museum interaction, potential of the interaction in organizing itinerary exhibitions, travel exhibitions, to make sure that in the regions of China and Russia, people would learn more about what kind of art has been behind us over hundreds of years. That's a very important factor in terms of interaction and directional interactions. And also, Andres, to make you happy, I'm going to conclude. However, let me also mention, in conclusion, that books will be devoted also to the 20th century, that is, through the assistance and interaction of the warriors and pilots among other people of Red Army who were served as instructors to defend the skies of China during many years of China's struggle for freedom, who the most decisive stage during the most decisive stage of the many centuries of history of Chinese people. And when Valentin Matvienko, member of the Federation Council last year, when they were laying the wreaths at the graves of the pilots who died in the skies of Wuhan, that was an important sign, not just as far as the members of that ceremony. It was an important sign for those generations, for later generations, people who were born at the threshold between Soviet and post-Soviet epochs, and also younger people from China and Russia who are inheriting those sets of values in terms of dialogue, in terms of what are the concerns of points of excitement of younger people. So we're going to devote a lot of time towards those activities too. So I'm almost kept to schedule. Thank you. If I only was able to, I would listen to you on and on. But let me not. Your dreams are coming true. You wanted to hear a speech by Mr. Oleg Petrovich Safonov. Yes, Alex Petrovich is the person who is able to tell us what's happening in the area of tourism. And also understand Alex Petrovich will probably leave us after he's made his speech. Alex Petrovich, over to you. Thank you. Good afternoon, esteemed colleagues, esteemed friends. Let me thank you for the chance to speak at such a representative forum. For us, this matter is a very important matter, because the role of humanitarian ties in the system of comprehensive partnership, which is being under discussion, it seems to us that tourism holds a key place in this matter, because tourism is not just about economy. Tourism is not just about 53 branches of economy which immediately come to life when tourists from different countries come to visit one's home country. But when we speak of tourism, primarily we have in mind humanitarian cooperation between different countries, and primarily for us, interaction with our friends from China's People's Republic is exceptionally important, because last year our country was visited by 1,088,000 guests from China's People's Republic. I want to emphasize this number and to mention that the growth compared to previous years was 15% plus growth to previous year. I want to speak about interaction in the area of tourism. It's important that the flow of tourism from Russian Federation to China, it grows too. Last year, the number of Russian tourists visiting China increased by 30% and amounted to more than 1,600,000 people. So the mutual flows of tourists are increasing in a very dynamic way too, and I'm hoping that these dynamics will continue in the future too. And also, the growth of the flow of tourism began after, in 2012-2013, a year of tourism was held between our two countries. In spite of the fact that tourists from the Chinese Republic visiting our country were leading in the flow of tourism, in general, the flow of tourism from China amounts to more than 100 million people. If we count in, as far as the flow of tourism into our country, then we're talking about slightly more than 1%. So, of course, in absolute numbers, huge numbers, quite encouraging. But we're also aware that it's a big prospect. We need to work to increase the incoming flow of tourists. We are working by promoting our domestic tourist products on the Chinese market. Since 2015, the Russian Tourist Agency has been building the necessary structure to implement the program. In particular, in the Chinese People's Republic, we set up 2 offices, marketing office, Visit Russia. Why 2 offices? For one thing, China is a big country, and also the fact that it's one of the leading tourist markets to visit. So, which is why we set up 2 offices, one in Beijing, the other in Shanghai. So the operation of those offices, Visit Russia offices, they've been quite active. We think also other tools are being used, such as exhibitions, forums, conferences, presentation tours, road shows, various forms of multi-vector interaction with the media, such as press tours and different filming and shooting related to the national calendar, various tourists and other activities. This year, we're planning to start work with specialized Chinese social media, of which there are several, by WeChat and others, in order to promote Russian tourist products on the market of China. We believe it's very important and promising direction because younger generation, of course, they mostly rely on the internet, social media to obtain information, to take various decisions, also in terms of choosing tourist destinations and making plans of their travels. Special areas for cooperation with Chinese People's Republic in the area of tourism are powerful mega projects. So I'd like to mention those as well. Military and historical, or so-called well-known red tourism. In the interests of promoting it, in 2015, a memorandum was signed on mutual understanding between Rostourism Agency and the main administration for tourism of Chinese Republic. Also, I'd like to mention that with our colleague counterparts from the main administration of tourism, we work very closely with them. Our interaction has a very friendly character, very active. In Russia, it was set up and implemented the inter-regional project Red Route, which is a historical educational tour spanning the following cities: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ulyanovsk, and Kazan. And it needs to be said that from time to time we get various cities and regions which would like to include, that would like to join this work, something we encourage because our country and Chinese Republic very much interested in expanding geography of mutual tourist trips because at present they mostly tend to be concentrated in our main industrial centers and in our capitals. So we are interested in expanding the geography of those routes. trans-border projects, the Great China Tea Route. That project is being implemented both by Russia and China and Mongolia. As soon as next month, we're planning a joint session in the city of Ulan-Ude on the shores of the Baikal Lake in order to consider the matters of interaction in terms of across the Far Eastern and Siberian region. And that will, let me emphasize, is going to be the second meeting of the heads of the tourist administrations of Russian Federation and China and Mongolia. We're working to create favorable, comfortable conditions for the state of Chinese tourists in our country. We're implementing the very major mega project, very promising. We call it Russian hospitality. In this format of this project, for several years, we've been implementing the project of China Friendly, which is aiming at creating very comfortable conditions for Chinese tourists visiting our country. Within the format of this project, there are more than 100 hotels already operating across different regions of our country. Other hotels are joining up. The facilities for tourists, airports, you'll be aware that much information is translated into the Chinese language, such as the signboards at airports at different regions of our country. Actually, it's all done. Announcements are made in the Chinese language. Different airports. We also create conditions for our country to be for wide use of the Union Pay international use of paying system in our country. So all those factors are very important for tourists visiting our country to feel comfortable and to enjoy convenience of things and to enjoy their stay here. Moderator seems to indicate to me that I need to speed up. You don't need to speed up. You speak fast enough. Well, you seem to be pushing me along, so I'm aware that maybe I need to cut short my trip, as they say. Yes, in general, yes, colleagues. The thing is, there are 10 of us, 10 speakers. So for an hour and a half, so in a comradely fashion, in a friendly fashion, to have a discussion, so that to avoid situation of a party meeting, let me also mention the mega events in the area of sports, which, in our opinion, are also conducive to developing humanitarian ties. This year, let me remind you, my colleagues, our friends, Russian Federation is conducting the Cup of Confederation, which will be held in 4 regions of our country: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Sochi, and Kazan. Next year, we'll see hosting the Soccer World Championship 2018. Just a few weeks ago in China, there was a start of the sale of tickets to the World Championship of Soccer in 2018. To take advantage of this opportunity, I want to invite our friends to draw your attention to, it's already possible to start buying tickets to come to visit us. We're hoping that in 2018, we'll see for at least 100,000 fans and tourists from China to participate in this world celebration of soccer. We have all the opportunities for this. Let me remind you, starting from the year 2000, we've had the regime of group visa-free trips for fans and tourists to be more convenient. So we've created the format of visa-free visits, and we are working on this with our counterparts from the Chinese People's Republic. So this number, as that was defined, not a minimum of 100,000 people, we should be able to exceed that figure of 100,000. Also, let me mention, we see as very important humanitarian interaction in the sphere of tourists. We work very closely with our counterparts, and of course, very happy for the opportunity to promote and develop mutual tourists through various platforms, mega event in the area of sports, and I'm thankful to the organizers for the chance to speak at today's wonderful event and to speak about our cooperation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. We do have a chance that the share of tourists, of Chinese tourists in Russia, will increase maybe from 1.28% to 1.5% maybe. We're hoping that this share will be increasing all the time. It is increasing. It's hard to say for sure how big it will be, but it seems to us that 1.3% is just the start of very serious long-term work. So the share will be increasing all the time and will be growing. and we'll be working on this jointly with our Chinese counterparts. Thank you very much. And we need to apologize. We need to excuse Andrei Petrovich because he needs to go on a business trip to Far East to win over more tourists. But when we listen to your reports, things seem to be not so quite good, actually. They seem to be quite good. So it's like by steps and bounds. Things develop by new offices are being opened up. Tourists are coming in. What about the foreign ministry? What's the outlook? Head of the first department of foreign ministry. I understand you're dealing specifically with China. China, not just China, but China primarily. Foreign Ministry Department, esteemed participants of our session. According to the suggestion of our esteemed moderator, I would like to dwell in the style of a telegraphic message. I'd like to mention particularly important points, which seem to be particularly crucial from the standpoint of the ministry, which basically oversees the entire set of Russian-Chinese relations. First of all, I think it's exceptionally proper and correct to have a separate discussion at this conference of the theme of humanitarian interaction. It's very correctly that the title of the session was formulated, the role of the humanitarian ties in the system of comprehensive partnership of Russia and China. Our relationships, our comprehensive partnership, strategic interaction, this is the system in which humanitarian interaction plays the role of which is as big as the political and economic interactions. Without humanitarian interaction, which shapes the social and spiritual basis for mutual bilateral relations, the entire structure of Russian-Chinese relations will not stand firmly enough. There'll be certain shakiness. It will be kind of shaky. I remember thinking back to the early 2000 years, late 1990s, our Chinese friends, when they were characterizing the state of relationships between the two countries, they say it was like the wind over the wood. The tops of the trees were shaking, wavering, but underneath it was very quiet and calm. It was a metaphor, obviously, to describe the state of relationships in which the broad masses of citizens of China and Russia, as far as the interaction between ties, Russia and China, very little involvement of ordinary citizens in those interactions. And it needs to be said that now the situation has changed radically. To the same extent to which Russian-Chinese relations, political, economic relations, comprehensive systemic interaction has improved and increased, by the same token, this humanitarian relationship interaction has taken on systemic character. Our interaction is a system, the system which spans both the state and civil society. It's a system in which a mechanism has been built for interaction along the state government lines, which covers effectively all the spheres of humanitarian ties. I specifically refer the mechanisms of regular meetings at the government level, which is in charge of humanitarian interaction. Humanitarian ties have become very important component of interregional interaction as well. We've come to have the wonderful format of Volga-Yanzi format, in which humanitarian component plays a big role too. Recently, a commission was set up which will be overseeing interaction between our Far Eastern region and Northeastern regions of China. And this is a commission. In that commission, humanitarian ties will play a huge role too. And finally, as they say, the last but not the least, it's the people's diplomacy. For many decades, we've had the Society of Russian-Chinese Friendship functioning all those decades, the oldest organizations for people's diplomacy, which has made invaluable contribution towards maintaining and developing interaction and cooperation between our two countries. So the activities of this organization continues, and as far as I understand, it becomes, if anything, more active. Without people's diplomacy, humanitarian ties will not be complete. That's quite obvious. Also, under the decision of heads of the state, there was set up committee, abbreviation of the Committee of 21st Century, its abbreviated name, which is also in charge of a wider range of matters, among which there's a humanitarian interaction is one of the priority ones. Thus, all organizational system essentially is set up. It's also reinforced by the presence of a wide range of intergovernment, interdepartmental, interregional agreements. Thus, in terms of the basis of agreements and treaties, it's in pretty good shape too. So, in other words, we have set up create all the conditions to move at high speed across a wide range of directions in promoting, developing our multifaceted interaction. And the early 2000 years and 2010 years of the century were marked by a vigorous flourishing of our interaction compared to the 1990s. And grand-scale projects have been implemented along humanitarian lines. The sphere of humanitarian cooperation came to engage large swathes of people and organizations. All this gives weighty reasons to suppose that, given that those efforts continue and the pace and intensity of these efforts continue, our communitarian interaction will continue to develop increasingly, and social and spiritual basis for bilateral relations will continue to strengthen and expand. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. It seems to me, actually, it's very substantial matter. When you speak, like you were saying, comprehensive humanitarian ties in the system of comprehensive partnership between Russia and China. Incidentally, every word here basically carries a riddle with it, enigma. What it is, humanitarian ties, what do we mean by this? I understand that this process has been described in diplomatic language, but I'm sure the borders of this definition are quite maybe shaky and maybe blurred. So I'd like to give the floor to Mr. San Zuzhu, Deputy Head of the Chinese Society for Friendship with Abroad, and also Head of the Chinese-Russian Friendship Society, a person who is clearly very much versed in those matters. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good day. Thank you very much for what Mr. Mezentsev already spoke at length about the work of our Society of Friendship. We make every effort to implement all our projects today. When speaking after lunch, our society, Russian-Chinese friendship, our society plays an important role in developing relations of strategic partnership between our two countries. We're proceeding from the fact of having single strategic interests and goals. We also have understanding and mutual trust, friendship between our peoples, between our countries. It coincides with the hopes and notions of the peoples of our two countries. Starting from the creation of China, at the time, there were very rich contacts between the Soviet and Chinese people. And in China, the high schools and schools and universities, there were teachers of Russian language. There was a rush of Russian language in China at the time. At the time in China, there were very active ties with the Soviet Union in the area of art. Russian, Soviet films, operas, ballet. They had a great influence over Chinese people. A huge number of Chinese students came to visit Soviet Union to study, to learn technology, art. You can say that the Soviet Union educated a huge number of Chinese talents, which subsequently played a huge role in the life of China. Besides, there were lots of other forms of contacts during which we learned from the Soviet Union, from Russia. But in the process of education of the personal cadres, those people came to love Russian culture, promoting vigorously the friendship between the Soviet Union and China, between Russia and China, which is why, even though we experienced later some difficult times, however, later on, our relationship continued their fast growth because we preserved the relationship of friendship, and those relationships remained constant. Our people's ties serve the basis for relations and contacts between our countries. Huge role is played by a sense of closeness and trust. What's the core of this trust? That is the closeness of the souls of our peoples. That's what's important here. So during our meetings, we discuss the relationships between our countries, and we should emphasize specifically the role of people's contacts, raising them to the appropriate high level position. To apply even greater efforts in this direction, and those efforts should be bilateral. Definitely, they should be bilateral. Recent years, we've seen the people's contacts between our countries have been continually deepening. We've held a whole number of the year of China, the year of Russia and China, the year of language, the year of youth, tourism, the media. And we've been actively engaged in those events and activities. We held a whole number of events in different areas relating to those national years, which may produce very good results. Of course, if we compare those events in the general context of strategic cooperation, people's contacts, people's diplomacy, of course, they leave room for further development, for improvements. Let me cite an example. You were speaking about tourism just now. For example, China has lots of issues in their relationship with Japan at present. For example, the Japanese government also they are distorting history also of World War II. They're distorting the history by refusing to admit their guilt in those events. But the Japanese government pays a lot of attention to people's contacts in order to remove prejudices of the Chinese against the Japanese, which is why the Japanese government gives a lot of priority to promoting people's humanitarian contacts, humanitarian exchanges, which are taking place at a high level. Last year, from China, the number of tourists going from China to Japan, what was the number? 6,370,000 people. From Japan to China, 2,600,000 Japanese tourists came to visit China. Given the fact that the relationship between two countries is very, very tense, it's a good phenomenon, positive phenomenon in the relationship between two countries. Now, as far as Russia and China, our cooperation in the area of tourism last year saw from Russia to China, according to our data, 1,800,000 people or more. From China to Russia, there was 1,680,000 and more, according to our data. Those numbers, no matter how you look at it, from the standpoint of strategic partnership or in general from any other point of view, of course, those numbers so far are quite small. But if we compare the population of Russia, population of China, those numbers, of course, are very, very small, much too small, which is why we must enhance understanding, cooperation, thus increasing humanitarian contacts, which, of course, not limited by the sphere of tourism. Of course, we can also improve cooperation in other areas. For example, the sister cities or the friendship of cities. 128 pairs of cities have friendly relationship in Russia and China. If you compare it with other countries of the world, the friendship of cities comes to the foreground here in terms of the numbers of course, there are certain limitations there too, and that is we have certain imperfection of mechanisms in this area. For example, more active friendship between near the border regions. As for other hinterland cities in Russia and China, those cities and towns there often don't have such ties, even though they are very eager to establish such sister relations with other cities in China and Russia, which is why I'm very hopeful that to enhance such ties, to hold forums to strengthen friendship of cities and towns in order for local governments, both in Russia and China, to have full engagement in this movement, and thus also enhancing humanitarian contacts. We want to, within the framework of initiatives of Eurasian Union and also of One Belt, One Way program, to have active engagement in active humanitarian ties. We need to turn humanitarian contacts into more important factors of our relationship. For example, possibly we need to, it might be a good idea for us to institute a special foundation for friendly exchanges between our two countries, so that our governments would support such a foundations for humanitarian and people's exchanges, people's diplomacy. Of course, economic cooperation also goes a long way to affect humanitarian ties. There are certain limitations. Sometimes things take longer than, but we need to expand this cooperation, this interaction. We need to be up, to keep up with the needs of time and to work towards the good of the life of the peoples of our countries. As for our society of friendship, Chinese society of friendship with countries abroad, we will continue our efforts aiming at across those directions, utilizing our advantage of people's diplomacy in order to utilize the maximum potential resources of people's diplomacy to use effectively and strengthen our friendship, to convert them into new incentives. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. We've been joined by Mr. Viktor Sadovnichi. Thank you very much, Viktor Anatolyevich. We've just been talking about interaction in the border regions, and in some sense, maybe the governor of the region which is adjacent to China, Mrs. Natalia Zhdanov. Maybe she could talk to us about different changes, maybe across border regions. What's the understanding of this humanitarian cooperation? What does it look like on the ground in practice? Thank you to esteemed organizers, participants in the conference, first of all, for this such a unique opportunity to speak at such a summit-level audience. Also, I'd like to congratulate, on behalf of all the border region of ours, our Society of Russian-Chinese Friendship, with the coming anniversary date of the formation of our society. The society did make invaluable contribution towards developing relations between our two countries. I want to report to you that across our territory, we've been for a long time, we've had a systemic and consistent activities of the branch chapter of the Russian-Chinese Society. Back in the 1980s, I used to work as a translator there and was actively engaged in hosting and in the rebirth of Russian-Chinese relations along the lines of those societies, giving new impulse to those relations. And indeed, the history itself, the destiny, we are destined really to be good neighbors. It's not for nothing that the Chinese saying, very similar to Russian saying, the close neighbor is better than a distant relative. Very similar saying. So the destiny, we are destined to have long-term, good, neighborly, friendly, mutually beneficial relations with our great Chinese neighbor. We, in our territory in the past, Chita region features one of the oldest schools in the Russian Federation. In the past, it was the oldest school in the Soviet Union, which was one of the first. From grade 1, children aged 7 start to learn Chinese language at this school. And this school has one of the most powerful methods of teaching and learning the Chinese language. One of the first chairs of learning the Chinese language. So clearly, those traditions which were born back in the Soviet times, which will continue to develop and enhance. Quite recently, we organized a center. And it's quite productive center already. Let's say a chapter of the institute headed by esteemed Sergei Gennadievich Luzyanin. So it's our system, our tradition. And bilateral relations, border relations, they were studying out actually from humanitarian interactions, from the language exchange programs for our high school students, for university students, cultural exchanges, sports exchanges quite recently. We started this tradition of holding joint international film festivals of Zabaikalian territory. This year, we're going to have this film festival. As years go on, with changes in social economic structure, we've started to develop new forms of cooperation. So today, China, particularly border regions, autonomous, also hinterland Mongolia and Kirundia province, they are our main economic partners, economic associates. Today, more than 50% in terms of value are accounted for export to China. More than 60% of value in terms of imports account for China. So across China, there are more than 500 enterprises were in our territory with the Chinese capital, more than 500 enterprises. By end of 2017, we are planning to launch many major joint ventures. You may have heard, such as Amazar, wood processing, cellulose plant, mining mint. So as far as development of our ties and relations, it's proceeding across all components. Maybe in terms of particular focus on humanitarian component. And then, as I mentioned, there are some language exchange programs, also joint events, projects in sports, culture, where very interesting project as far as the promoting family tourism. The thing is, in Hay border region, which is borders on our territory, there are lots of ethnic Russians. Immigrants who are living there, very unique phenomenon. They've been living there for a long time, but they're still preserving their Russian traditions, Russian culture. They speak the Russian language, and they've passed on this knowledge of the Russian language to their children and their grandchildren. And a very interesting project. We're promoting it very vigorously. So the promotion of such, you might say, family border relationships, family type of tourism, you might say. We're also promoting, as was mentioned by the head of the tourist agency, we're also promoting the movement of trans-border joint trains from Manchuria to Irkutsk. So we're involved in this consortium of tourist trains. Very soon we are planning to start implementing many joint projects, not just as far as humanitarian component, but also our territory essentially is an agricultural territory. So our Chinese neighbor, and they are very wise and knowledgeable cultivators of land, so lots of projects in the area of agriculture. But also not just, I would like to mention not just achievements and not just to list achievements, there's lots and lots to list and describe. But also I'd like to mention a few points, a few issues. May 14th, Vladimir Putin, when speaking at the forum in Beijing, was saying that the time had come when it's necessary to lift all infrastructure limitations. And this statement is very relevant as far as our Trans-Baikal territory. Today we're speaking about promoting border cooperation, strengthening interregional ties, but at the same time we have not the well-developed border infrastructure. Our border regions are in a difficult condition. We have 5 checkpoints at our border through which we're promoting our humanitarian interactions. Those border checkpoints, they require very serious reconstruction, very serious improvement. Besides, we don't have opportunity to promote our cooperation in the area of agriculture, such as husbandry, because there are certain limitations that are in place too, effective limitations. So we're putting great hopes now. We're aware that negotiations are underway to lift those restrictions as far as the exchange of meat products. We have faced very serious limitations as far as the promoting tourism in the actual border areas, because there are certain serious rules in place which limit the presence of tourists in border areas. So maybe there is a need to go back to considering maybe making changes to the legislation as far as lifting such barriers and restrictions, considering that now we have different times and different vectors of the state policy and from Russia and from China. And so in this context, we're pinning great hopes to the draft law, which is under discussion now, on promoting trans-border cooperation. We also have great hopes that by end of this year, our 15 Trans-Baikal regions were included in the concept of trans-border cooperation, federal concept. We put forward several proposals for discussion at the first session of the Intergovernmental Commission on Trans-Border Cooperation for Yuri Petrovich Trutnev. And in general, we are quite finishing. Let me mention briefly. We're finishing the development of the comprehensive plan for social economic development of Trans-Baikal region. We were developing this plan directly under the instructions of the President of Russia. These days, we are getting all the necessary approvals. Very in brief, this plan concerns the main directions of the development of competitive directions of our economy, such as mining industry, wood processing industry, agriculture, and of course promoting tourism. And going through all those leitmotif, the common thread of all those directions is the maximum effective use of the full capacity of our trans-border factor, which is very beneficial location, being bordering on great Chinese neighbor. In general, across our territory, we have the border lying one of the longest borders in terms of strategy and politics. It's an important border for our country. The length of this border almost 2,000 square kilometers, and most of that border line actually lies. It's with China, with the border territories which I mentioned. So it's clear how important it is to us. In general, to promote to have a stable, consistent development and functioning of our relations, which is why in our plan of development of Trans-Baikal territory, we give priority to this trans-border factor. Utilizing this advantage, we give a very, very big priority to this. This is probably the main premise of our plan, the main direction of our plan. And in conclusion, perhaps, if you allow me, maybe as by way of suggestion, humanitarian cooperation has been taking place all these years in terms of we know this in terms of tourist exchanges, learning the languages, Russian, Chinese languages. Maybe one of these years, maybe to conduct humanitarian cooperation, maybe in the form of the year of exchanges of researchers and education. And the reason I want to mention this such emphasis because our region, Trans-Baikal region, is prepared to be engaged in this very actively if such a decision or similar decision is taken. In any case, you can always count on our Trans-Baikal territory. We sometimes refer to as a pilot testing ground in terms of trying out various projects as far as the trans-border relations at the new stage of historical development. Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia Nikolaevna, for your participation in our conference. for your responding to our invitation, and within the framework of the statements you've just made. Now, on the instructions of the board of the Russian-Chinese Friendship Society, I would like to indicate certain initiative of the humanitarian forum, not just the Silk Route project as such, but also the Greater Eurasian Partnership Forum as a platform for an analysis of interaction, both within in the format of humanitarian ties of the Eurasian countries with China, and also a new format of Shanghai Organization humanitarian interaction, especially considering that very soon this Shanghai Organization will be joined by Pakistan and India. So the 18 countries of Shanghai Organization and also the countries of ASEAN. So what we've just indicated, that indicates the need of the region, not just Trans-Baikal territory, but many other subjects of Russian Federation, which for many years have been consistently building system of partnership relations in this sphere. So the target specific programs is one of our priorities, which is featured in the plan which was signed last year with the chairman of the Chinese-Russian Friendship Society on the part of China. So we are perfectly aware it won't be possible to build this relationship just only from Moscow alone, and we won't be even try. So taking into consideration the experience of work of other chapters of our society, such as in your territory, work of many of your colleagues, support that we've seen, we definitely see this area of work as a joint endeavor, and the moderator has been less strict, but I'm just being quiet. Now, I'd like to devote 1 minute to the meeting which we had during the visit of the head of the Chinese Parliament, Mr. Joseph, to Moscow. There was a meeting between Mrs. Valentina Matvienko and the Speaker of the Chinese Parliament and representative of the Russian-Chinese Friendship Society. And heads of the region spoke at that meeting. Head of the Bashkortostan, who is actually drives the friendship in the format of Volga-Yanzi framework. Also, heads of Amur region spoke there. A head of Khabarovsk territory spoke there. So it was quite obvious that heads of the regions today, the way they see interregional interaction, among other things, emphasizing humanitarian interaction, they see it as an important priority. At the same time, not wanting to compete with other sessions we'll have tomorrow on economic interaction, which will be discussed tomorrow. So not wishing to compete with the sessions tomorrow, we hear what our Chinese counterparts telling us, supporting interaction of small and medium-sized businesses, attempt to lift mental barriers, the barriers of not knowing Chinese and Russian legislation as far as law of commerce, law of trade. So we want to put forward initiative to put out handbooks, maybe in the form of electronic form as well, the handbooks which will explain subtle points and specific points of legislation, and maybe based on the experience of some mistakes that were already made in the past by Chinese businessmen in Russia and also by Russian businessmen in China. So based on the experience of failures as well as the experience of successes. So all those kinds of experience were analyzed, so that might help to avoid mistakes in the future. So based on it's not enough to have a foundation of trust. You need to be specifically prepared in terms of knowledge. So the interaction in terms of small-sized, medium-sized businesses, that's very valuable too. Very, very valuable. Thank you. As our sessions proceeds by and by, thank you, Natalia Nikolaevna. And in terms of broad understanding of humanitarian interaction and human interaction has lots of multiple dimensions. One dimension particularly to do with the education. We're talking about, there's a whole set of different vectors of cooperation. As far as I know, Mr. Sadovnichi, who heads major university, but I'd like also first to ask Mr. Andrei Sharonov, president of Skolkovo Business School, which is a place, a trendy place, a popular place, and often receives mixed reports. But what's happening there is really, really highly interesting. And maybe you could share your insights and observations.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Andrei. Yes, I will share my views, and I would like to briefly quote a few stats related to the higher education, but more or less related to the business education. A few figures as to the general education. Annually, more than 20,000 Chinese students come to Russia, and this is a quarter from all of the foreign students who arrive in Russia. And the Chinese students account for the second place after the Kazakhstan students amongst the foreign cohort amongst higher education institutions. But at the same time, that accounts for about 2% of the Chinese students who travel outside of China. And traditionally, the lion's share goes to European and US universities, which is 53% of all of the Chinese students who travel towards those destinations. The Russian students in the counterflow go to China, and during the past 4 years, this number has grown up to 15,000, which is threefold growth, and this number of Russians has taken over the number of Russians who are traveling towards Europe, which was about 10,000 Russian students traveling to Europe to get educated. And Viktor Sadovnichi will give us more substantive statistics and about their successful project together with the Beijing Polytechnical University. But let me remind you as well that the Russian government also implements the program which is called Global Education, which covers the cost of education to those Russian seekers of the MBA or PhD levels in 250 foreign universities. So amongst these 250 leading world universities, we have 8 Chinese universities from the mainland China and 5 universities from Hong Kong. And the reason I'm saying it is that the Skolkovo School administers this program, being involved in selecting the Russian applicants and their employment in Russia. And I can say that a certain deterring factor is the lack of an agreement on mutual recognition of educational certificates issued by the Chinese and Russian higher education institutions. Now closer to the business education, I may say that, to our mind, both the Russian and Chinese businessmen at different levels do feel mutual interest and the need for a broader information about each other and about the terms of doing business in the two countries. Last year, in the territory of Skolkovo Business School, we held a Russian-Chinese business forum for small and medium-sized businesses, and we polled the attendees. More than 90% of the Chinese participants and more than 80% of the Russian participants expressed their willingness to and the need to receive additional education when working for partners from each other's countries. And the prevalent majority stated their interest towards short-time applied kind of programs rather than longer courses. And let me draw your attention to the fact that President Putin, during the last summit on May 14th, 15th, very substantively referred to the need to have cooperation specifically between the business schools. And in as far as specific factors are concerned of our cooperation with the Chinese schools and towards the Chinese destination, I may say that during the past 7 years, more than 700 attendees of the certified programs and MBA and executive MBA visited China as part of the specialty educational module, as part of 18 months long executive and program and MBA program. We have 2 educational modules. One of them is taking place in the Silicon Valley in the United States, while the second is running in China. And almost during the past 7 years, that has been continuous, and this geography encompasses all important cities: Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Hangzhou. And traditionally, our attendees are meeting with the representatives of such well-known companies as Huawei, ZTE, Alibaba, Tencent, and both Hong Kong and Shanghai stock exchanges. Now, in its turn, there are about 300 Chinese businessmen in the counterflow which got educated at such key Chinese schools as Hong Kong Greater School of Business and the Jiao Tong Business School of Jiao Tong University. And they also went through the education in Skolkovo as part of the Understanding Russia educational program. Part of them we are monitoring, while part of them we brought a Russian partner into their businesses, or they set up an activity in the Church of Russia. Apart from that, I will say that in the autumn of last year, we signed a strategic partnership agreement with the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and we are going, as of next year, to launch the double executive MBA certificate program. So as you understand their program, I mean the business school from that university, they are doing it together with the Kellogg's Business School. And in the course of the past 10 years, 7 times the Kellogg Business School took up the first place according to FT ranking. And so their willingness to share out this experience essentially makes it almost a partisan program. We're setting up a separate educational program which is Pivot to the East, the Chinese Strategy for Your Business, that's the title of it, which is being attended by Russian entrepreneurs who are thinking or about to start doing business in China. We do that with the support from the Ministry of Economy and the Chinese Trade Office in Russia. And in conclusion, I can tell you that we also have a certain research agenda, which is the Center for Fast Emerging Markets is being done with. This is Fast Emerging Market Center in Skolkovo. The first one is the research done, a strategy for internationalization of the Russian and Chinese companies, because we have respective cases. Second area of this research is related to the analysis of the current social and economic environment in China, where we are doing 2 regular analytical products, monitoring of the Chinese media. We do it bi-monthly. And the second is a quarterly analysis of the social and economic reforms, which we have been doing since 2012, where we present the current trends in the development of China. And we certainly work as part of the analysis of the initiative One Belt, One Way. And at the same time, we are not only looking at China, but also at other countries in the Central Asia and their involvement in this process. Thank you. Thank you, Andrei Vladimirovich. And thanks very much for fitting yourself into the timing. I know that you got to run away on your errands, but indeed it's very interesting. But at the same time, I would like to now raise a question with Viktor Antonovich Domnichi, who is the president of the Moscow State University. Thank you very much for joining us. But as they say, you have a very specific and very successful story of how the current university was set up in its natural value. Please share it with us. Thank you, dear moderators. It's a great honor for me to speak at such a high gathering. And let me continue on what Andrei Sharonov was speaking about, education. But I would allow myself, together with the slideshow, to recall on the history of how we started working together in this most important area. Back in 1808, the Emperor Kunsi set up the first school of the Russian language in China. And after several decades, China published the other first textbook of the Russian language. So we definitely can be proud of the history of our cooperation and mutual learning, which exceeds currently almost 300 years. In 1925, there was a well-known university in Moscow, and all of the leaders of the People's Republic of China graduated from this university, and Deng Xiaoping, amongst others. And so we do believe that that was a great page in the book of our friendship. But let's move over to 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union times. It was then when we had 10,000 Chinese colleagues and Chinese students who were being educated in the Soviet Union. And I attended my first year at the university together with these guys who, on a prevalent majority of them, attended the Moscow State University. In those days, 12 institutes of the Russian language were established in China, and additionally 5,000 students were learning Russian in China. And as of 1952, in 57 Chinese higher educational institutions, Russian language was taught in all the secondary schools in the northeastern provinces and in those institutes. And so this page of our cooperation remains to be a decisive one, because on November 17th, 1957, Mao Zedong visited the Moscow State University, and in the Hall of Assemblies in the Moscow State University, he spoke out to both Russian and Chinese students, saying that the world is yours and ours, but it fundamentally belongs to you because you are the young, you are full of energy, you are the ones like the sun, up at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. So our hopes are with you. And that was an outstanding event in the life of our both countries as well, certainly in the life of the Moscow State University. After that, there was a bit of an interval in our cooperation, not as intense. And so I would resume making references as of 1996, when that year became the year of China, while 1997 became the year of Russia in China. And so on October 27th, 2007, the Ministry of Education of China came to the Moscow State University, and the Confucius Institute was opened. The Chinese delegation was headed by the member of the State Council, the esteemed Mrs. Liu Yangdun. In this way, we started the cooperation of a more substantive nature, including in academic research. And on May 6th, with the participation of the chairman of the State Duma of the Russian Federal Assembly, Mr. Narishkin, and the vice premier of the State Council, Liu Yangdun, there took place a ceremony of putting into the foundation of the memorable stone in the place of the construction of the main university building in the Shenzhen University. And that is a joint university between Moscow State and the Beijing Polytechnical. The architectural foundation of this new building is done of the replicas of the buildings resembling the Moscow State University, where the space of the development is 280,000 square meters. The construction of it is in full swing. Several floors have already been erected, and the completion of the construction of this Moscow State University in Shenzhen will be finished in 2018. But we, so far, have opened a joint Russian-Chinese university for the first time ever in the history of both our countries' relationship, which is a joint university. We have enrolled the students to the master's degrees programs, and almost these days there is an enrollment taking place for bachelor's programs: Russian language, literature, applied mathematics, physics, chemistry, mechanics, economy, and all of the classes for the bachelor's and master's in this university, although in the adjacent building, will start in September, while on September 7th at the state level in Shenzhen, there will be an official inauguration of this joint university. The leadership of the Chinese People's Republic will attend it, and so I believe that it will be part of the state visit of our leadership to China, and we will not only put the cornerstone into the foundation, but also will inaugurate the first classes. And I believe this is going to be a very important event in the educational cooperation between our two countries. One certainly must prepare oneself to get enrolled and really turn this university into a very high level. That is why we are holding competitions. So we held this competition for the students from both of these universities, and the first round was attended by 50,000 school students from senior classes from different Chinese provinces, and the winners out of this 50,000 students from schools will become the students or will come to Russia to get further educated. And I told you about this project because I believe that this is a very important, very significant one, because it has been approved by the leaders of both our countries. If you was about another project, it is really nice to hear these references to this project, One Belt, One Way, Eurasian Economic Union, etc. And one should say that our scientists, including the ones from the Moscow State University, are doing some serious work trying to substantiate it in a scientific way. And so the book which we published together with the Academy of Sciences, where we propose that this belt should be extended out of China towards Alaska, so that it could serve as the belt for the development of all of the regions, both in Siberia and the Russian Arctic. And this kind of validation is what we have been able to do. We several times reported to the Russian Parliamentary Upper House and at different fora, and I hope that it will remain the subject of the discussion when further considering the future of One Belt, One Way initiative. I would like to describe yet another stage about another project of our cooperation, the university's rankings. There are several rankings, and as a rule, one finds them in the Anglo-Saxon jurisdictions. And we are of the opinion that these rankings certainly do affect university life, because the young people select where to go depending upon where these education institutions stand in this ranking. And so we suggested that we should come up with yet another Moscow International ranking, which will cast a broader look at the life in universities. And this is the ranking which we discussed with the presidents of various universities in China. And almost just a few years ago, the chairman of the party committee of the Beijing University, Hu Yaoping, visited Moscow State. And so we agreed that both the Chinese universities will participate in this new international university ranking, which we launched together by the Union of the University and Institute Presidents in Russia. And in this way, I would say that we will be in a position to attract students to apply to our universities, as well as Russian students to Chinese universities and the Chinese students into Russian universities, relying upon an objective ranking that we have prepared. And so we're going to publish it within the next few days. Another example of cooperation, associations, there are quite a few of them, Association of Technical Universities in Russia and China. It was set up in 2011. The Bauman University is the lead education institution on our side, and the Chinese universities, the branch of the Harbin Polytechnical University, and now the Association of the Far Eastern and Siberian University of the Northeastern provinces of China. This is the Pacific State University, the Northeastern University of Harbin, very actively working association they are. And so on May 24, 2016, in Moscow University, there took place the BRICS University Association meeting, which we created together with the president of the Chinese University, with a purpose to promote the work done by the BRICS universities and our universities over the science and education and humanitarian area. And I'd like to mention yet another very unique initiative, which I hope will find a continuation. In 2012, the Moscow State University was visited by Li Keqiang, who at that time was the vice premier. A little bit later, we learned that he became the prime minister of the Chinese People's Republic. And so he was speaking at our assembly hall, and it seemed to me that unexpectedly to many, he invited 300 Chinese students to come and stay as his guests for 30 days in China. And so 300 Moscow State students were chosen who traveled and spent time in the People's Republic of China. They saw a lot, and in response I invited 100 Chinese students to come to the Moscow University on similar terms, so that they could stay and enjoy spending this time in the Moscow State, studying Russia and the Moscow State University. And that was a great initiative, the exchange of such student groups. So what could one say? This is a great discovery, for our cultural and educational relations. Another project in 2016, on July 5, we were visited by about 300 rectors, the deans and presidents of the Chinese education institution, and that was part of the cooperation under the aegis of the Humanitarian Cooperation Commission, which held a forum considering various other topics on its agenda. And so that forum, the commission of the Chinese rectors was headed by Li Yangdun, and we agreed that we will set up an association of the classic universities of China and Russia. And here we see Mrs. Golodets, who is our vice premier and the vice premier of the Chinese People's Republic. And so we agreed that we will be creating an association of classic universities. And so on September 7th in Shenzhen, like I mentioned previously, there will be inauguration of a joint university, and the statutory documents for this biggest association of the deans and rectors of the Chinese education institutions and Russian education institutions will be signed. At that meeting, we signed 15 agreements between the higher education institutions of our two countries, which encompassed almost all the educational areas and academic areas. But it's interesting, how many agreements does the Moscow State University has? It has 150 agreements with the Chinese higher education institutions. And the Moscow State University is currently being attended by more than 2,000 Chinese citizens attending the preparatory classes or already as students. And so we certainly think that with opening our joint university with Shenzhen and with the creation of the association and because of other agreements and projects, this number of students will continue growing. I'm very happy that we're going back to those great times when the Moscow State University was attended by 5,000 students from the People's Republic of China, and we, in order for the students to feel comfortable, even, organized a special, Chinese kitchen in the Moscow State, which was much cheaper than the Russian kitchen. And I remember also I was going to have my meals there, paying just 30 kopecks for my lunch. So I believe that we will ultimately get back to having more students, and we will be again ready to open a special Chinese kitchen for the students. So I do say that we've got a great cooperation which is continuing, and I'm very grateful to the chairman, to Igor Feldrich, to you, for having got this opportunity to share with you information about this cooperation. Thank you. Thank you, Viktor Antonovich. You've missed out on the lunch that we had here, but I hope that next time, during the next conference, you should join us immediately for lunch, and we'll ask our Chinese colleagues to expect you for that. Now, thank you very much, dear colleagues. This panel is invariably coming to an end, but before its end is 2:05. So this is a bit of an issue, because nevertheless, I would like to very much ask the Deputy Rector of the Nanking University, Zhu Gonglei, to join us in this sharing of the experience that China has. Dear Mr. Chairman, dear friends, I am very happy to have this opportunity to speak in front of you and share with you information about humanitarian contacts between the universities and express my viewpoint. I have prepared my presentation in advance, but because we are limited in time, and the further we go, the less time is left, I decided to put my presentation to aside, and I will try and speak in a more focused way and share with you 2 points of view. The first one, it seems to me that humanitarian contacts between the universities of our two countries take up a particularly important place in the area of humanitarian contacts between the two nations generally, because we know when we talk about humanitarian contacts, the area of this context is too broad, and here I am talking about scientific contacts as well as educational contacts. And this is somehow a narrower strain of such contacts, but I do assume that the humanitarian and social sciences in our two countries, as well as the relationship between the universities in our two countries, do take the core position, or particularly significant role they play. And there are several special things about it. First, and the universities which are most renowned do have very strong academic and research base, and we have very good equipment which meets the requirements of and needs of the societies and the communities in many examples. For example, in China, we are researching various social and humanitarian sciences, and 80% of such research is concentrated specifically in the universities. And I suppose that the same situation is in Russia. But what one may say about the social sciences, if we are to talk about broader kind of context, it is immediately apparent that the universities do play a very special role. For example, we have exchanges between the art departments of different universities, where art takes up a very important position, because contacts in the area of art between our two countries are also very important. Our second point, between the universities, exchanges in the area of social and humanitarian sciences should be something which should never cease, should have this continuous and stable nature. We can hold exhibitions, fairs, conferences, but once we are done with them, we somehow forget about them. But the relations between universities are constant, and they do exist on a continuous basis, be it a student exchange program or holding joint research. This kind of cooperation has this continuing nature. The third point is in the area of scientific and technical contacts. Very important is the role that the young generation may play, because universities primarily, work for the youth as their customers. So in the relationship between the universities of our two countries, we need to anticipate that the most important beneficiaries of our contacts are the young. And so the relations between the young people is what we should hold in the focus of our constant, unflinching common attention. Right now, we are very happy to see that essentially at any university one can witness the processes of internationalization taking place, as well as the development of internationalization is something that every major university pursues as a strategy, including the Tonkin University, which is no exception. By being involved in external relationships, we have entered into several international university unions. We hold our own international fora. Although we find ourselves in the city of Tenzing, we hold the Tenzing Forum with the participation of international entities and institutions and other fora. Last year, we, together with the Russian partners, also held such a conference. It was just last month that it happened, and therefore we have a lot of space to cover with our cooperation. For example, the students in China who are studying Russian for 4 years, all of them are traveling as a minimum for 12 months to spend in Russia. And today, before I left home, I did a little bit of polling amongst the students who are studying Russian. There are about 26 students altogether. Of our students. Russian students in China. And so we asked them, what do they think about such humanitarian and social exchanges? And all of them responded that it's not enough. The level of development of our contacts that we're currently having, that it has to be strengthened. And so we do hope that as a result of joint efforts, we'll be able to make these humanitarian and social contacts more active by taking them up to a higher level. And so I do believe that quite possibly we would need to apply our efforts to several areas and pay attention to several such initiatives. to the qualitative factors I've just stated, that we spoke about tourism, that on the one hand there are a lot of tourists, but on the other hand, from the point of view of an ideal figure, this is far from reaching an ideal number. So humanitarian and social contact between our two countries is not only the issue of international relations, this is also an issue which is at the core of the development of our both countries. And so, right now in China, we are living through a bit of a crisis in the area of secondary education, and we also need to go into restructuring and strengthen our partnership with foreign universities, because until 1997 or 2007, the rural population was in greater numbers than the urban one, so the structure of the population density changed, and so we need to also study that and take it into account and use it for our future development. Our second point, where is it? Yes. One should develop new areas of cooperation. For example, we're already talking about cooperation in the area of Chinese studies. We work in the university, and I personally am supervising humanitarian and social disciplines. I personally believe that we should develop and turn Chinese studies, the sinology, so to say, into a new kind of sinology, which I understand not only as the traditional Chinese studies, which touch upon the humanitarian subjects, but all the modern day social studies. We certainly need to study Russia. We ought not to study Soviet Union only. We need to research the post-Soviet social and economic problems as well. We need to strengthen our cooperation in these new areas, take into account their importance and significance. We should pay more attention to that. Thirdly, some of the guests have seen it, and they mentioned that we need to strengthen ties and cooperation between the young generation, and so we would like to come up with a special idea that between the universities of our two countries, the exchange of young teachers, postdocs, and masters should also become more intense. Apart from the exchanges which we were having in the traditional areas, we should develop new disciplines for exchange programs so that people would come not only for 12 months, but also to have them coming for a short period of time, for 1 month, for a few months, so as to apply more flexible forms of academic exchange. For example, today when we had lunch, I got acquainted with one Russian professor who told me that one should recognize the rankings and the mutual periodic publications, which is good for Russia and for China, because we have very good periodic printed publications that we somehow are not aware of, or we do not know of, because there are certain key publications which do play a very important role. And I would say that this proposition by a Russian professor is a very good one, but simply because there is very little time left, because I've been speaking at length already now, I work in the Jiangxing University, and our university is very much hoping to be able to strengthen its cooperation with different Russian universities in humanitarian and social sciences. So welcome to the Nankai University. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, and I would like to particularly, note on the way universities prepared for our session with their presentations, like Viktor Sadovnichus and our colleague Zhu Ganglei. Thank you very much. That was very informative, very much enlightening. But our chariot is hasting forward, and I would like Vladimir Gusev, director of the Russian Museum and the Academician of the Russian Academy of Arts, to also say a word. Vladimir Alexandrovich, please. Dear friends, very esteemed moderator, first of all, I'm very grateful to you and to my destiny that finishing of the conference will take place after my presentation and not before. And I promise that I will be very laconic and will reduce the number of projects I initially wanted to enumerate. And this is indeed a very important thing, because a lot already has been stated about the very powerful dynamics and development of the intergovernmental Russian-Chinese relationship, but just in passing, and quite justifiably, it was also mentioned that not always we are fast enough to catch up with our leaders in a substantive filling of what this new level of the humanitarian relations may ask for. And that is why I'm going to tell you about the two projects which are becoming a reality, which are coming true. And they are the two ones which follow in the wake of the so-called people-to-people diplomacy. In the spring of last year, we, with the Shanghai Association, we signed in the area of exchange culture and art with foreign countries a very substantial, comprehensive agreement. The three tasks are quite feasible. This is exchanging various exhibitions that has already been mentioned today, and that is something that is in the core activities done by museums, and we agreed with its excellent Shanghai Museum to exchange exhibitions, and it is very important to develop these exhibits into the regions because they become better in terms of the economic project, because exhibiting is a very dear, pleasure whenever they happen simultaneously in 2 or 3 cities. So we are ready to cooperate in this area. The second level is setting up a virtual or electronic version of the Russian Museum. Currently, we've been able to open up 220 such branches, and on a daily, every month, the number of them is growing. But it's not about numbers, and I will tell you about it later. But the electronic virtual offices or branches make it possible to undertake cultural exchange. I mean, if the exhibition in the virtual or in the real space and time costs hundreds of thousands of US dollars and sometimes over the millions, this particular project doesn't require any palaces or any premises. It's very democratic. It doesn't require a lot of money to be spent on it. And the third thing is the multifaceted, multi-profile center of the Russian culture and Russian art, a big set of complex of buildings, and actually it's very useful for me to hear what Mr. Sadovnikin mentioned, because when the Chinese colleagues were offering this project, they suggested that we should build a full replica of the Mikhailovsky Palace, and I somehow refused, because in museums, museum people have very cautious attitude towards replicas, but in this particular case it reflects on the Chinese mindset, because they have this wondrous capacity to use these superior examples of the world culture, and so I don't find anything bad about it, and so I believe that I will rethink my attitude. And so in November, towards the end of this year, there may take place approximately the same kind of an event which we witness right now on the screen, where a cornerstone is going to be put into the foundation. There is a piece of land, there is a territory, there is a project in hand, and so when the leaders of state are going to meet each other in July, this project was mentioned, and it was supported by the letter from the Chinese chairman administration addressed to the Russian president and vice versa. And so I believe that in November there will be a presentation of the big program of the Russian-Chinese relations. And so this project will be included, or should be included, is expected to be included into the agenda. But here is the issue which I wanted to touch upon because of the people-to-people diplomacy. Now we came to the signing of this agreement after 24 months of work done at the level of the association. But the association is not a governmental institution, so those were human contacts and certain discoveries. One had to understand the way the mechanisms in the Chinese bureaucracy work. But it all was very useful, and it made it possible to sign a real, tangible agreement. But then on, during this transition from the people-to-people diplomacy, which is from the non-government institution realm, there should be a transition towards a government level, because from then on it's going to be proprietary issues, land allocation issues, and the political resolution issue. And our Chinese colleagues really became very happy having learned about today's meeting, and they are looking forward to the future meetings as part of the Shanghai Organization of Cooperation for this particular project to be further promoted in China, so that by November in Shanghai because the mayor really, joined us after we signed, because I think that he's too busy to really get on track. And so there's a very complicated level of relationship between the provinces and the center in Beijing. But let me repeat it again, this is a very real project, and so it would be great to have our cooperation with you help this project. And the second thing, the number of virtual museum branches, it includes only one branch in China, in Beijing. It was set up in 2012. In 40 universities, we have our representative branches, and we also opened one at the Moscow State. And you see, in Beijing, as part of the joint initiative of cooperation with the Russian Cooperation Council, again, during the first 2 years, there were so many visitors, but somehow it started, subsiding, whereas in the past there used to be, tens of thousands. Right now it's just hundreds. But one has to understand the reason. But I'm trying to say that the most successful work our branches do in universities, in higher education institutions, and in schools. Whenever there is an interest towards the Russian language, and there is a group of students studying Russian, and I'm a member of the Russian Learnings Council with Olga Kolodets, and every time I am trying to talk about combining the geography, because the plastic, the fine art, and the combination with the language is what really makes it. And so the experience shows that whenever Russian is being taught during various courses and juxtaposed upon very much artful expression, that is something that would make somebody interested to dedicate some time, to the Russian museum, because that is would suit all different age categories. And in this case, learning Russian is more dynamic, more successful, and that is crucially important, because I also do remember when I attended the Fine Arts Academy how many Chinese students there were. And so going through the halls of the Chinese Museum of the Contemporary Art, without any mistake, I can see who of the artists attended whose classes, Princesses Milnikovs in Russia in their time of studies. And therefore, this problem, the problem of the language barrier, does exist not only in China, but also in the relationship between Russia and the countries that Russia used to have very close relationship, but the ones which, because of various political reasons, they cease to be so close. And so the senior generation speaks perfect Russian, sings songs in Russian. The former Shanghai mayor, we could converse in the Russian language without any problem, and the Podmoskovny Vechera, we could sing together. But to find a young, good translator was a problem, because the young generation, they prefer to speak English at times. So here we've got to try and win this competition. And again, it is really very important, with the help of the public institutions and the International Affairs Council and the Society of Russian-Chinese Friendship, to combine geography and what we do, because there is an association of interpreters and translators. There is an association of the studies of the Russian languages. There is the Association of Russian World, which we launched 8 projects together. There is a Russian library with virtual reading halls. We can combine the geography of our project, and in that way, all of it will be successful. So far, I haven't succeeded in it, because some were ambitions in the way. But a certain intermediation is necessary, which could. So we're ready for cooperation. Well, I guess that takes me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir Alexandrovich. Thank you very much. It was really so interesting, so stunning, because I'm impressed with the diversity of the human cosmos of cooperation. Andrei Yurich, can I just say one word in order to calm us down? Because Vladimir Alexandrovich said that he was in doubt whether a replica should be built. In my turn, I also had a big doubt, but they saw in my office, the Chinese colleagues, the portrait of academician Pavlov, drawn by Kori, which was a copy from the original portrait by Nesterev, and it was better than the replica. And so they told me, here, you are having a copy in your office, so let's do a copy of the university in China. All right, yes, sometimes copies are better than the originals, I do grant you, because that applies also to the translation and interpretation and everything. And so before we give the floor to our last panelist for a certain response, who is Vladimir Gusev and Alexander Rajkov, before we give the floor to Alexander Vasilievich, who is the deputy head of the Federal Agency for Cooperation, let's move from pictures to books, and we'll ask Yuri Pula on behalf of the Russian Publishing Association. You can speak from where you are, as you find convenient. The only thing I would ask you to somehow be as brief as possible. Thank you, Andrei Georgievich. I will do my best to be brief, and I would like to speak about another very specific project now that we are speaking about specific projects, which the Federal Agency for Publications and Mass Communication is overseeing, the one I represent. And Dmitry Fedorovich mentioned that certain books are prepared to be published as part of the humanitarian cooperation. And so we, as the federal agency, we also have a project which is currently being executed, and the books are being published. And here I'm talking about the fact that in the process of cooperation with the Chinese counterparts, we found out that we have an understanding of what kind of literature one finds both in Russia and in the People's Republic of China, relying upon the classic writers, because in China everybody knows well Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Turgenev. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, and in Russia, people read Confucius and Lao Tzu and Sima Qian. But as it turned out, that the contemporary literature is the kind of literature which to a very large extent is terra incognita. And the Chinese literature for the Russian readership, as well as the Russian literature for the Chinese readers. And a decision was made that this classic writings produced by the great writers of both countries is our golden reserve, but you cannot sustain on the golden reserves all the time, even though they're gold ones. So, feeling this sentiment on the part of the readership, in 2013, the main government office overseeing the affairs of the printed media, cinematography in China, and the Federal Agency for Printed Media and Mass Communications in Russia signed a memorandum of mutual understanding which called for the Russian literature library to be published in China in 50 volumes, in Russia also the Chinese literature library also in 50 volumes. And what was meant that the main emphasis in these libraries will be made upon the modern literature. Now, coordination of this effort to publish these libraries was tasked to the Chinese Society for Collective Copyright Management in Literary Productions and the Russian Institute of Translation. Two of these institutions very energetically went about this common project, and the first volumes became available to the public already 2 years ago. Let me not enumerate all of the books which were published both in Russia and China. I will mention just a few names of the authors of them, which were published. Tian Yin, Van Men, Olga Slavnikova, Roman Senchin, Hen Zhenmin, Lao She, Yuri Polyakov, Sergei Yesin, Mikhail Tarkovsky, Yu Hua, Van Anyi. This is just a short list of names of the authors of the books whose work was published in Russia and China. As can be seen from this short list, work over these libraries is in full swing, and there appeared a bit of a competitive spirit in terms of who will be able to publish more during this reporting period. And so people have started, counting. The Chinese colleagues were saying that they're publishing more, we tried to insist that no, it was us who were able to publish more. And as a result, a very interesting detail was discovered that, as it happens, the quantitative characteristics that we apply, they also have a different measure based upon our mindsets, because in China it is usual to publish books, to publish works by different authors in separate books, while here in Russia we like to produce voluminous publications, and in one volume you may find different works by one author, but we were able to find a point of correlation. So we decided to acknowledge that it's a parity in Russia. In China, 22 Russian authors were published. In Russia, 23 Chinese authors were published. And so I hope that this work will continue. And so in such a very encouraging way, we will continue working in this area in the future. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Yuri Sergeyevich. A very interesting, set. Lao She and Yuri Polikov, they're like siblings. They look like each other. So at least this is one cultural style. So thank you very much, Igor Sergeyevich. And now I would like to ask practically to hear the final concluding presentation. Alexander Vasilievich Radko, the Deputy Chairman of the Federal Agency for Cooperation of the Independent Commonwealth of Independent States, to share with us his feeling on humanitarian cooperation, whose diversity is simply exceeding the imagination. Thank you very much. I am very happy to welcome in this room the representatives of all of our countries in today's world, along with a growing volume of economic cooperation. The humanitarian component in bilateral relations is also coming up high, and we've been able to be convinced in that through the example of a mutual growth of the tourist volume, as well as in a greater number of different events of joint nature in between mutual years to a multiple number of projects in the people-to-people diplomacy. So everyday work of the Russian Cultural Center in Beijing has proven being very much sought after by local people, because its today's activity moved beyond the borders of its building, whereby the majority of the events take place outside in the various universities, Russian clubs. The center is actually cooperating with the government and non-government organization, amongst which one should particularly identify the Chinese People's Association of Friendship with the abroad, and well as the alumni of the graduates of the Russian universities, the Association of the Veterans of China. And so we do see the potential for growing in quality and quantity of such joint activities, for example, dedicated to the joint dates in the history of Russia and China. There are active formats that are being applied also in our humanitarian cooperation, such as topical and thematical years, similar to the Russian-Chinese Year of Media, when, with our support, the young representative of the Chinese People's Republic visited the city of Ulyanovsk as part of the Russian-Chinese Forum Young Correspondence. As part of a short-term visit by the young foreign leaders called New Generation, on an annual basis, we invite the young Chinese experts to participate in different projects in the territory of Russia. During the past 3 years, the number exceeded 200 people, and this is far from being a limit. We are quite confident because we see the level of interest that the Chinese youngsters demonstrate to participate in the 19th Festival of Youth, which is going to take place in October this year in the city of Sochi. And here we can see almost a doubling of those willing to come to Russia, as opposed to the quota, which was 265, which means that the new generation of both countries are very much intent on developing this context and bringing our countries closer together, not only now, but in the future as well. We see also educational cooperation strengthening, and what's indicative is the demand for education in Russia. For example, throughout the past 3 years, we see this very strong growth in the applications coming from the Chinese applicants. In the current year, Russia will present the Chinese youngsters with more than 900 government-paid places in the education institutions, while more than 2,000 applications were processed. So the demand is twice exceeding the supply, which is pointing to the need to look for additional resources to meet this demand. We also see the growing interest towards learning Russian language in China, where today more than 57,000 students are studying Russian, and school children and those who visit language courses. However, we feel also the lack of the support in having a sufficient number of the Russian teachers. There's a good potential in improving the situation with the centers for Russian studies and the classes for Russian studies, and with the opening of Russian studies centers in the Chinese universities. Another major step forward in raising the level of affordability of the Russian language and studies for Chinese would be setting up the regional centers of the Russian Cultural Center and affiliates by bringing in the experts from the Russian competitors who live in China. This kind of step would enable us to develop the cooperation not only in the central Chinese provinces, but in other very important provinces in the Chinese People's Republic. We have the experience that we have developed, and that makes us possible to critically praise the experience that we already have achieved and set ourselves new tasks aimed at achieving new quality in our bilateral relations. Today, when our two countries have built a very firm foundation for the cooperation, we already have very serious achievements in the humanitarian, which we are ready to multiply by by taking the proven models and taking them out to the new regions. There is a need for that on both sides, and quite obviously that with the strengthening of our economic relations, this need would only become stronger. And so already now we need to raise the bar and deepen our cooperation, and in amongst such venues as this conference, to define our future steps. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. But still, just in conclusion, Alexander Vasilievich, Vladimir Alexandrovich Gusev somehow reproached you that you are not as active as you can be. Well, I hope that you will respond to this, or maybe something in the way for you to say something about it right now. Yes, you are sitting both together, because you reproached the Russian Agency for External Cooperation. Yes. We've just had a word between each other, because I told him that I will look something into the possibilities of that the Russian Museum is not doing something. But all of our electronic branches, we were setting them up with the sponsorship support. So we do need this sponsorship support, because sometimes we're short of money for travel purposes. So we'll need to think about what can be done in Beijing, because there's a very good man in charge of it. It always depends upon an individual, because if there is a brilliant in one's eyes, you don't need money. Everything is running on its own. Alexander Vasilievich, do you have this brilliance in your eyes? Can't you see? All right, thank you very much, dear colleagues. So this panel, I believe, was a bit tiring, but very interesting. But please, wait a second. Please take your seats. It's not in it. So I do understand that everybody is very much exhausted, but nevertheless, first of all, I would like to express the words of gratitude to the organizers, to Russian International Affairs Councils, and to the Russian-Chinese Friendship Society, and ask the chairman of this society and one of the leaders of this panel in the humanitarian discussion, which is a kind of a structure which is acting as an umbrella for all of it. I would ask you, Dmitry Fyodorovich, just in a few words to summarize the results. Thank you. Andrei Georgievich, today you set a very light, but at the same time very deep tone to our conversation here, in a slightly humorous way, raising this issue, what humanitarian cooperation is all about. And you asked the panelists to explain what they think about it. So, reiterating the question, what is humanitarian cooperation? This is something that we listened to very brilliant, very active individuals speaking about, without telling us about new things, and not forgetting about the tradition of that cooperation that we have between Russia and China. I would like to offer a special round of applause to them for that, and express the words of gratitude to the moderator at this panel, Andrei Georgievich. We do understand that it was not very easy for you to keep everybody to the proper timing, but at the same time preserve the environment of warmth and engagement in making it possible to voice so many good ideas. And so I'm very specifically, very responsibly, I'm saying that whatever we heard today by way of various initiatives and proposals, we will not only very thoroughly consider that, but together with our colleagues who spoke here, we will get into the practical side of this. Yes, thank you very much. Only a wise man can be torn between the mind and matters, but let me remind you that we are to continue in parallel sections after the coffee break, and right now it's a coffee break. Thank you.